One more minute, then we'll start. Okay. So some quick updates. Instead of a test on Wednesday, I'm pushing it back to Monday. And we'll use the lockdown browser. And I'll put a test into Canvas. So that way everybody will have a little extra time. And on Wednesday, we'll cover what we missed last Monday. I made those changes visible to everyone on Canvas in terms of the dates, as well as updating the schedule. I do not know if the lockdown browser does need a camera, but I do know it's now showing up on Canvas as a way to get in. I think from here on out, if you have questions, go ahead and send them direct to me in chat. I'll either get to them later or try to answer them if I see them while we're going. I will find out more about the lockdown browser and we'll send out a practice test for it. And that practice test will add a couple points to the actual test that is Monday, because I don't want you trying to go here the first time when it's actually time to take the test. I will, in fact, open the quizzes after we're done with class today. But for now, let's get started. Today's topic, I believe you're viewing the PowerPoint on project management and cost control. As we've talked about during the semester, you will be assigned to manage projects from time to time. And I've noted if you are lucky, you'll get a chance to establish the budget and the timeline. Though more often than not, you don't really get that lucky. So first, a little video on what project management is. If the volume is too high or low, please let me know in chat. That sounds too low.
Everywhere you look, projects are underway. Whether you're recruiting a new member of staff or constructing the world's tallest building, every project needs a manager to ensure its success. Someone with their eye on every detail at every stage, from inception to completion. Put simply, project management is about getting things done. It's about knowing exactly what you want to achieve, how you're going to achieve it, and how long it will take. It's about ensuring that everyone involved shares and understands those aims before the first steps are taken, and that they continue to as the end of the project, whatever it is, draws closer. Because successful projects don't just happen. They're not just a long list of jobs to be done. They're a masterpiece of planning, management, organization and communication, a carefully choreographed sequence of events where progress is smooth and steady. One step leads seamlessly to the next, and every possible hitch has been considered and counted. A successful project needs people with the right skills and knowledge at its heart. Working together, a well-managed, motivated team with clear roles, responsibilities, and reporting lines will carry a project to its conclusion without compromising on time, cost, or quality. Project management is a wonderful thing, but it's easy to forget how the world might look without it. Because at its best, project management is virtually invisible. It's the absence of problems and the prevention of failure. But behind every successful project, whether it's changing the way a company works or the organization of an important event, there's an unsung hero, the project manager, who kept everything and everyone on track to ensure the delivery of the desired result. At APM, we support project managers in all the amazing work they do every day. If you'd like to know
So as this video shows, just a quick view of project management, paying attention to all of the people you have helping you. And in this case, maybe what software they have to offer to help you with that. Every video that is viewed will have a link within the PowerPoint, so you'll have an opportunity to watch it again later. So when we think about project management, we think about costs and time and tasks. And in particular, we're going to look at cost control. As I said, if you're lucky, you have the opportunity to establish the budget and the timeline. And if you're extra lucky, you'll have the opportunity to pick the people that help you. So we'll consider that all in the planning phase. Once you have identified all of the tasks to be done, you will frequently break them down into their pieces and create those work authorizations that actually allow people to work on their task. If it was your day job, you might have a job description, or you may have a checklist. In the case of a project, each of the parts of the project will have output that is desired. Probably also have criteria that needs to be met. And the individuals working on it with you will be responsible for those tasks. In order to manage the budget, you really do have to figure out how to collect the data and have someone report it. So for example, if you budgeted for someone who can draw in AutoCAD 40 hours to work on one particular portion of the project, somehow you need to collect the number of hours that that person has spent drawing for you. Typically, we have that worked out with an accounting department. And the next phase, after you've defined how you're going to collect the data and what kind of reports you want, the cost accounting effort begins. Ultimately, collecting all this data isn't necessarily the outcome you need, which is obviously a completed functioning project, but rather it's a tool that you use to manage the costs of this project. If someone has taken 80 hours to do a task that you expected was only going to take 40 hours, perhaps you need to find out, did you underestimate it, or are they doing other work on this same project and it's being charged to your budget? And I say your budget because if you're put in charge of a project, you're not only going to be held responsible for the completion dates and output of the project, but the cost of the project. Frequently, that output and the costing are also reported to customers and your managers. Your goal as an engineer, and is in particular when you're responsible for managing a project, is going to require that you keep track and be prepared to answer questions when they come up. And so while you'll have periodic reviews with a project, with your managers, with your customers, you're going to have a lot of information that may or may not come up, but it's in your best interest to be prepared for about anything. When we talk about the elements associated with cost management, you're going to start out by estimating the effort required. If you've identified each of the tasks that must be done to complete this project, then you have had the opportunity to think about what that task is and how long it will take to do. Some tasks will require multiple people. Some tasks are yours and yours alone. But in order to create an expectation for how much it will cost to do a project, you're going to estimate each of those tasks. That doesn't mean that you have to do it alone, of course, but it does mean that you have to collect that information from other experts in those areas and roll it all up to create this estimate of the overall project. As I said earlier, we're going to work with an accounting group most of the time. You may find a different way to keep track, but generally speaking, when you're working for somebody, most people will end up with charge accounts against which charge their time. So if they're working on current production, they may charge a production work order. But if they're working on this special project, they may have a different charge account to use. The larger the company, the more likely that this is the case. In smaller companies, you're trying to balance everything. You may not actually take as much time to break the costs down to the smallest components possible. It is very common, of course, in a major project, in a large company, when you're working with AutoCAD people, production people, engineers, etc. When they're working on your project, they are charging your project. When they're working on production, they're charging production. That allows you a chance to see if your estimate was good and to see if they're working at a pace with which you expected. So the cost accounting is going to collect all that data. It will include other things, of course. If you have to purchase items for the projects, you will have estimated how much of that you will need, and that will become part of your cost accounting. Just collecting the data, of course, is only part of the puzzle. As we do with financial reports for any given company, we're basically going to have small financial reports for a project. In this case, you may look at it weekly or monthly in order to verify that you are on budget, under budget, over budget, and give you a chance to take corrective action as needed. You may see that it's taking about 25% longer than you expected to do a particular task, and you might have to extrapolate out to other tasks of that nature, and you'll start to see that your project will be over budget in that particular case. The problem with projects is you get an assigned budget, or you get an approved budget if you had the opportunity to create that budget. And so companies agree to spend money on a project based on their expected cash flow. Remember, we are still paying our employees, we are still buying materials, we are still shipping product, and typically money for a project is going to come out of savings that they've made for such a project, or from profits or excess cash flow that they will direct at the project during a normal calendar year. So when those project costs start to get out of hand, the company needs to know this. They need to figure out, is this project something that will do what they want by the time it's all said and done, and it's still worth it? For example, if a project was expected to cost $100,000, but it's starting to look like it's going to cost $150,000 because of unexpected cost overruns, that company may decide that the payback is now too long and choose to close out that project short rather than spending more and more money on something that is not necessarily as helpful as they originally thought. Things that we know impact our costs, our direct labor costs will vary. And during any given year, depending on the company, you could see that employees get raises and you didn't budget for that. You could see that they hired a new manager and you didn't plan for it. So all of a sudden, instead of charging $30 an hour, now it's costing $35. There are other things. Sometimes companies have incentives for their employees, and any additional pay becomes an impact on your budget. Some projects will have incentives to get done faster, or penalties if you fail to accomplish by a certain date. In addition, profit sharing, bonuses, unexpected expenses by a company could start to impact your costs. You may not have control over them, but you will always have to manage your costs in the face of that changing environment. So why are we monitoring costs? As we said, we definitely want to know that our personal estimates are good. And so we're monitoring how much effort people are putting in, and to a certain extent, how efficient they're being. One thing I know, if I'm budgeting for a job, if I'm estimating a job, I know how long it takes me to do something. What I frequently find is that I have to almost double that for employees. So as you get better at estimating, you'll be more accustomed to managing others and the expenses associated with them. But if we've budgeted $10,000 worth of production labor and we're 10% done and we've already spent $3,000, well, we want to be fair warned. We want to start to look at what is going on and try to correct that situation before you find yourself at $30,000 of labor instead of the original 10 you planned. So we're going to monitor that. Similarly with purchases. If we're expecting to purchase items at $100 and they come out as $150, you probably want to know that your budget is being impacted. You most certainly want to know if people are placing orders early enough so that you don't have to pay expedited shipping and things of that nature in order to achieve your project goals. So by monitoring these resources, we get to measure the status of the project and accomplishments. So we might identify a prototype as an accomplishment that a customer requires. And so at some point, when you achieve that goal, you can compare it to when you actually got it done, or you can compare it to how much it cost you to actually achieve that goal. So you are measuring your project's progress and being able to discuss this with your customers and your management teams. It's at this time you also can start to see we expected to be at $100,000 worth of project costs, but based on how much it's taken to get to this point in our project, we're going to revise our estimate to 125,000. Or it's taken us 6 weeks to get what we thought would be done in 4 weeks. So our expectation is that we'll take a little bit longer. We are looking at what we expected and what we have actually achieved. In both these cases, when you're looking at costs or you're looking at schedule, you will be asked to tell us why, in fact, you're off target in money or off target in time. So as we are looking at our projections and we're looking at our accomplishments, as project managers, we are specifically looking for opportunity to improve. We're looking for the causes of failure, and we're trying to plan corrective action. If we're 2 weeks late at 1/4 of the way through a project, there might still be time to make up those 2 weeks, as long as you understand what the problem is and can work on that solution with the group. Another thing that you might see is that if your labor budget, for example, is higher than you expected, perhaps what you'll see is that the people that have been assigned to this task to support you are the most expensive employees that exist, and you just budgeted for the average employee. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it bad, because theoretically, the most expensive employees are the quickest, so maybe they can get it done faster, but it costs you a little more. But you're going to be asked questions like that when you come into a project status review and you're over budget or you're behind schedule. So you're going to identify those problems and plan corrective actions associated with them. When you think about a cost management system, the best situation you have is to have that cost system, the data collection and the data reporting, established before you ever offer anybody time to actually work on the project. You don't purchase anything, you don't authorize anybody to start work on anything until you have a way to collect that data. Ultimately, the earlier in the project lifecycle that you can collect those costs, the earlier you can take corrective action if those costs are trending outside of your control. The later in the project, it's going to be much harder to make up a 20% deviation in cost or time if you don't know it until you're 2/3 of the way through the project. But if you see it trending early, you're going to be able to take action early. So whenever you get involved in a project, please work to implement those cost management systems with your accounting group or however you're going to keep track as early as you possibly can. When we think in terms of project variance, we can think in terms of cost variance, as in it costs us more or less than we expected, or in time variance, we got it done before or after we expected to. So there's some typical terms, some common terms that are used when you think about variance analysis. And the first one we're going to talk about is the budgeted cost for work scheduled. So you spent this time, you got involved on a project, and your job was to estimate how much it will cost to complete this project. In doing so, you broke it down into small steps. You estimated time for each of those small steps and how much that was going to cost. Maybe it's 40 engineering hours, 80 production hours, 5 hours in purchasing, whatever it turns out to be, whatever that company's cost per hour for those commodities are, you're going to have created this budget. And it's for the work that you're planning on doing, the work that is scheduled to be done to complete this project. We can compare that now to work that was actually completed, so earned value. Let's consider that a portion of the work has been completed, and you have collected costs for that work, but in this case, you've budgeted costs for that work. So if you expected a particular task to take 40 hours, that's your budgeted cost for that work. When that job is complete, when that portion of that task is complete, that is the budgeted cost for the work performed. It's still right in line with your budgeted cost for the work scheduled. But now that you have that task complete, now you have a value that you have earned in terms of your project. But that value may have been earned at a different cost than what you budgeted. So we have this actual cost for work performed. So if you planned 40 hours of work to do it, and it took 50 hours, our actual cost for that work performed was the 50 hours. 10 hours more than you budgeted. So this is data that you're collecting from time cards or from other accounting control systems. And it's as true for materials you purchased as it is for work that you've completed. So when we look at our cost variance, we look at the amount of work we completed in terms of the budgeted cost of work performed and the actual cost of work performed to see if we have a variance. If we took 50 hours to do 40 hours worth of budgeted work, our cost variance is minus 10 hours. We spent 10 hours more than we had planned in this particular project. You could look at it as you've spent $1,000 of cost to do the work, but you only budgeted $900 worth of cost. And so you are at a cost variance of $100. You've overrun by $100 at this point in your project. Cost variance isn't only associated with dollars and cents. Variance can also be associated with time. So you have your cost variance and you have your scheduling variances. If we plan to do it in 4 weeks and it took 6, we're beyond schedule by 2 weeks. This video that I'm going to show you talks about a project in Boston that was identified as the Big Dig. Let me bring that up, and once again, let me know if there's any problems with the video or audio.
By North American standards, Boston has one of the most exciting and vibrant downtown cores, but even 20 years ago, none of that was the case. There was right here a huge elevated highway system, really an urban blight that cut off the residential areas from the downtown. And what's more, it didn't work. Traffic was always congested. And so local politicians came up with an ambitious program, something that would prove to be the most expensive highway project in American history. They called it the Big Dig. First, though, how are they going to pay for it all? That's where tolls come in. Or, yeah, you're going to receive plates. It's going to take about 4 decades to pay all of this off. Thanks very much. And even then, it's spread out over a very long time. But there is one key difference between the U.S. and Canada, and that's that cities down here can borrow for big projects like this. Burying the highways took an awfully long time. It began in 1991, and the thinking was it'd be done in 7 years. Of course, it wasn't. It took until 2007. It wasn't so much time, it was money. Originally budgeted at $2 billion, final tally, $14 billion. Big cost overruns, big delays. There are still some leaks here, lots of corruption and graft. People were charged in the course of many investigations, but at the end of the day, they got their tunnel. They buried those elevated highways, that urban eyesore. Take a look at the traffic, moved very well. This is an infrastructure that Boston has become very accustomed to, very happy with. That tunnel system now runs, well, right below us. There are 6 kilometers of green space running the entire length of Boston Port that came along with a new subway line. All of this, of course, may not have happened had Boston known the true cost of the Big Dig at the outset. They may not have undertaken, but it can be said that a major infrastructure project has fundamentally changed the very nature and vibrancy of this city. David Common, CBC News, Boston.
So one thing that occurred in the Big Dig was that, among other things, there were more than a few disasters. And apparently, if you can hear my wife on her Zoom meeting, I'll apologize for that and try to get rid of that later. On the Big Dig, they had several disasters, one of which was the ceiling apparently fell down and crushed a car that was driving through, which then took them back to square one to figure out why. In that particular case, it turned out to be some kind of adhesive that held the cement ceiling up, which to me is odd because I don't think of cement and ceilings and glue holding it together. In the case of the Big Dig, their cost variation calculation, they budgeted 2.8 billion and spent 14.6 billion. So quite a large cost overrun at $11.8 billion. In the case of the project reporting that you will have, you're going to continually being asked, is it done yet? And how much will it end up costing? This is a place where your logical brain should take hold. On the estimate at completion, what we're looking for is to compare our actual cost of work performed and our budgeted cost of work performed and find out what that ratio is. So if we are 25% more in actual cost than budgeted cost, and we're halfway through the project, it's not really appropriate to try and estimate less than that 25% overrun by the time the project is done. So for example, if you are planning on spending $100,000 and halfway through this project, you're 25% over, then your budget at completion, your best estimate at completion, will end up being that $125,000, not your $100,000. I think what is realistic is that you will try to reduce your cost overruns in the second half of your project, but it is not realistic to say you will fix all of your problems in the second half of your project. So our estimate at completion as engineers is that we will manage this project at the same burn rate, the same rate of expenditure as we've done so far, even though we will try to find ways to reduce those costs. So that is the estimate at completion. It is the best estimate of total cost at the completion of the project. In this case, periodically, we're looking at the status of the project. Quite often that is monthly, but it depends a lot on what that project is and who you're being managed by. One thing we can note is that there's project variance all along the way. If we start out planning our expenditures over time, you have the costs that you planned. Some of it is material costs, some of it is labor costs, some of it is design costs. but those costs are projected along the way. What you'll find is that the costs don't actually come in your straight line, because purchasing will buy something earlier than you expected in the project. Somebody will be late and not have started something in the project. So your costs over time are not going to follow your projected cost curve. Ultimately, you want to see, are any of these deviations from your projected cost actually warnings to you? Like if your labor cost is continually going up out of control, then you're going to want to have identified that. But you're going to always look at your actual costs and say, oh, okay, well, they spent an extra $500 to buy that thing. That's going to be a permanent increase. If everything that's purchased costs more than you budgeted, you will expect a deviation upwards on your overall projected costs. There's a concept called management reserve, and that is associated with your budgeted costs. So let's say you're a new engineer and you worked on this budget, and your boss is used to these kinds of projects more than you are. So he comes and he agrees with your budget. He may not tell you that he believes it's too low, but he wants you to try to achieve it at your budget. And so you go ahead and get that project going with the budget you started with. As that project moves on, if you have a little bit of cost overrun, then what you'll find is that your boss was protecting both him and you, because he may not have told his bosses or his customers your released budget. He may have told them some budget that's a little bit higher, knowing that as a new engineer, you're a little bit less likely to get it right the first time. And his experience over the years says that you're likely to be off by 10% or so. By giving that higher budget, when something costs a little bit more, you can say, hey, listen, I'm sorry, this particular thing costs more than I expected, and we need to increase the budget. It's going to cost more. It'll give that boss the opportunity to simply say, I got you, we're covered. I'll take care of it with everybody. You go ahead and do what you need to do. So your boss is budgeting in a little bit of newness on your side in order to achieve the goal that his bosses expect of him with you. Now, later on, it may be that those actual costs exceed what he budgeted, what he reserved for this project, and you may end up having to get additional funding for it. But now the amount being asked for may not be quite as bad. So management reserve is effectively your customer or your manager's intent to minimize the problems associated with small cost overruns. Now, when there are cost overruns beyond the management reserve, you got to find where that money is coming from. If you're doing a project for a customer, then they've agreed to a budget. And if that budget is going to be overrun, they're going to have to agree to that overrun somehow. So we'll consider that a funded contract change. The customer knows what's going on. They've agreed to continue the project. They've agreed that they will spend more than they originally planned. They may write a formal change to the project, to the budget, or they may just give you the go ahead and pay additional on any invoices that you might send to them. In the case of that management reserve, maybe he had more money in there than he told you. And so it's a little bit of money available to take care of that additional cost. It also could be that your manager always under budgets, and the executive team of that company knows that, so they already had a higher number in their mind also. Nonetheless, the additional cost has to be approved along the way. Sometimes companies get caught completely unaware and they have to start pulling money from other areas. So maybe one year they had planned to give a 5% bonus to everybody, but your project went over, and the management team, the executive team, may have decided that it's more important to pay the extra it's going to take to complete this project than it is to give everybody a bonus. Now, if you knew that, you'd probably feel bad, but at least that project would continue to completion. And the reason they would do that is because the value of the project may be such that next year it can be bigger bonuses for everybody anyway. Other places that it may come from, they may have to borrow money for it, debt or equity capital. They may have to find additional investors. They could decide that they're going to take some of the profitability of the company and turn it back in. So in the case of retained earnings that will be spent on your project. But there are other places that additional money comes from. In all cases, though, someone is agreeing to spend the extra money that the project itself is worth it to the company. When we talk about project status reports, we will always have to be able to answer questions on variance. What is causing a variance? So for example, early on in a project, you might find that the purchasing agent ordered all the material, the stuff that takes 15 weeks to get and the stuff that takes 1 week to get. And so he spent money at a different time than you originally expected. That's a simple cause of a variance. Usually no foul. It's just spent earlier than it needed to have been spent in some cases. The cost variance associated with something taking twice as long as you planned, it's a little harder to work through. Is it taking twice as long because it's a harder task? Is it taking twice as long because the people that have been assigned to it are less familiar? What are the reasons for that variance? And trust me, you will be asked these kinds of questions. We'll always want to know if the variance is going to impact the schedule and costs, and if so, to what extent. So for example, if it's taking 6 weeks where it was expected to take 4, will that variance continue so that everything else will be on time? It's just this task that was impacted, or a bunch of tasks are going to run 20 or 30% over and the project won't finish on time. Similarly with the costs. In the case of the purchased early, that doesn't impact the overall cost of the project, just the timing of spending money. Whereas taking an extra 2 weeks on every task will certainly impact the costs. When we've identified what that variance is, did we already identify what to do about it. And in fact, did we do something about it? Many, many managers will be asking you, okay, you identified the cause of the variance, you identified the impact, what are you doing about it? Generally speaking, as an engineer in those situations, you want to be ahead of that curve and present the variance, the cause of the variance, the impact of the variance, and the corrective action all at the same time, so that you're not kind of brainstorming what to do about it. It won't always be that the management team is accepting of your assessment or your planned corrective action, but at least you've started something to correct it. If you do take the corrective action, what is going to happen to it? So for example, if you're 2 weeks late, are you going to assign more people to the task so that it can get done quickly? Or are you going to be happy with the 2 weeks late and no additional cost versus that? So maybe you want to have people working overtime at a higher rate in order to recapture some of your lost schedule time, even though it's going to cost you money. So knowing what you want to do and what it will achieve, perhaps working overtime will get you back one of those 2 weeks, and the customer or your management team can decide, yes, the extra expense is worth it to us because we'd like to get this project done earlier rather than later. How often are we reporting on projects? It depends a lot on what the organization is and what the project type is. So for example, if you are working on a high-profile failure analysis, picture yourself on the 737 MAX project, people are going to call you every day to get a status report on the failure analysis. Probably more than every day. Probably become a barrier to you actually making progress in some cases. If you are on a construction project, you're building out a new building, starting to get a construction site done, commonly every week they look at what's completed, what things need attention, what's going to stop them this week. So we're looking weekly on that kind of project. Research and develop projects tend to be monthly or quarterly, so that we are looking at longer term projects with longer term actions, maybe more study, more analysis, more prototypes. But we're still looking at it on a periodic basis to make sure that it is in fact going the right direction. As we know already, monthly we're looking at things like income statements and balance sheets. So monthly reports on financial performance are common in these cases. When we're reporting progress, usually we're answering 4 questions. Where are we today? Are we on budget? Are we on time? If not, why not? All right. Where will we end up? If we continue at the pace we're going, we're going to end up being over budget, but on time. We're going to be on budget, but late. Where will we end up? If there are problems that you see brewing, this is a time to start talking about them. You can never underestimate the experience of the team that you work with. And so rather than see a problem and try to resolve it completely by yourself, now is the time where we talk about what the present and future risks are. What is going to keep us from achieving our project completion on time and on budget, even if it's not sure. So you might have a vendor that has some delays, and if they are in fact late, it will impact the project. Maybe there's nothing you can do about it, but at least noting it within this arena is helpful to everybody. Finally, what problems need additional help? As a project manager, you're going to end up with all of the responsibility and frequently none of the authority. So if someone isn't doing their job, your only recourse is to ask them to do their job. But if you continue to ask them and they still don't, now at the time of a progress report with managers and customers, you may be in a position to say, listen, I really need someone to get this task completed through this person. I've been unsuccessful. It hasn't completely killed our ability to finish this project, but it is the kind of thing that could. The number of times that a customer is part of your problem will surprise you. Customers need to give you data. They need to test things. And the only way you are going to complete a project is if they complete the portions that require their input. It's not uncommon for me to send a drawing set to my customers for approval, and it takes them 2, 3, 4 weeks to actually give me approval, and then their project ends up being late because they haven't completed what I need from them. So that's project management cost control. And first of all, do you guys have any questions for right now? If you do, you can either chat to everybody, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I believe everybody could hear you.
Are we going to need to have anything special for the exam on Wednesday?
I have no expectation of special things. The final exam will require a calculator. Well, it depends on how good you are with math. But as far as this exam goes, it will cover the materials since the first exam. And it will be, once again, true, false, multiple choice format. I'm still learning how to actually give that exam, so I don't think there's any additional we need to know. But we'll find out with the lockdown browser, for those of you who don't have a camera, what that will entail.
So should we use our old exam, the study fist exam, or it's going to be completely different questions?
Old exam?
You said that the material from the first exam will be on this exam as well?
No, absolutely not.
Oh, okay.
The exam material is everything after the first exam up until Wednesday this week, because we're pushing it back one class period.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll stay on here. If you've got questions, feel free to ask. If you guys want to head out. And we'll talk again on Wednesday.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Who is Judy? Who is Judy?
So I was kind of curious how the professors are enjoying doing this online format. Like, do you guys like this better than teaching in person? Is it easier because you don't have to leave, or
Personally,
yeah,
I don't like not seeing people's reactions because I can never tell at all if if a point was understood or misunderstood, whether I have to back up. So the fact that everybody's video of themselves is muted makes it more difficult for me.
yeah, yeah, I can definitely
So
see that.
yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. It's kind of nice doing it from my office,
Yeah,
but at the same time, it's a new to me, so I'm learning how to manipulate between the video and the PowerPoint and whatnot.
uh, so it's maybe for the rest of the semester you teach like this. Have they said anything about next semester about maybe continuing this, or do you think it will
I
be?
I haven't heard anything of that nature yet. I
Um,
haven't. All I know is after this is done, I'm doing my Toastmaster meeting this way too. So that's going to be fun.
very cool.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I was just curious, so thank you. I enjoy this just because I don't have to drive to campus and like
Right? That's
2 hours
nice.
to get to class, and it's still pretty good. So
Saves me at least $15 a week for parking.
I park like a mile away from like half a mile away from campus, and it's good because I don't need to pay for parking. But I get parking tickets occasionally, so it balances out.
Yeah, I
So
understand.
cool.
So, all
Well, you have a good day. Thank you very much.
right, man. See you later.